Hi, my name is David Lopez, co-dean of Rutgers Law School in Newark, New Jersey, and this is The Power of Attorney. Today, we will celebrate the legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who sat on the Supreme Court and was a legal titan, but was also a professor at Rutgers Law School from between 1963 and 1973. So today what I want to do is I want to explore her legacy from people who knew her. So with me I have Elizabeth Langer, who was the editor-in-chief of the Women's Rights Law Reporter, which was the first law review dedicated to issues of gender equity and justice. And the Women's Rights Law Reporter's first inaugural advisor was then Professor Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I have Rita Bender, who was a student at Rutgers Law School when Justice Ginsburg was here, and then was on the faculty, and now is a civil rights lawyer in Seattle. And then I have Professor Paul Tractenberg, who is a professor of law emeritus, Board of Governors Distinguished Service Professor, and he is the one who wrote the history, the definitive history of the Rutgers Law Newark campus, called A Centennial History of Rutgers Law School in Newark, opening 1,000 doors. Thank you all for being here today. Okay, so let me start with you, Paul, and just really talk about really big picture about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's time at Rutgers Law School. And really set the scene of the era.
I'd be happy to do it, David. I'm pleased to be with my old friends Elizabeth Langer and Rita Bender, both of whom I know for a lot of years. So let me try to put this in context and sketch out a kind of trajectory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg at Rutgers Law School and obviously thereafter. As David indicated, she was on the law faculty from 1963 to 1972. And there was a time when the law school changed in some very fundamental and I think highly relevant ways. In one way, its student body diversified enormously. We began to get women law students in great numbers. I think we became the first law school in the country that actually had a majority of women as our students. It was also a period when the law faculty began to diversify. There was one prior woman on the law faculty, to Ruth. Ruth joined in 1963. The law school went through some enormously important changes in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I think in some ways, the students led the way to sort of radicalize the law school and to radicalize the faculty, and I think Ruth was included in that. We went through rebellions or riots, whichever you prefer, in Newark in the late 60s. That led to Black students taking the lead and trying to bring the law school up to date in its views and its curriculum and its practices. And I think the faculty went along with that and began to support it. And Ruth was an instrumental member of the faculty in that regard, although I think if I look at the broad span of her life from the time I got to know her, she and I overlapped for 2 years on the faculty from 1970 to 72. She was very quiet. She had been teaching civil procedure. She gave only scant signs in those first years that she was going to be the kind of towering figure in law and society and in our country that she became. But certainly, and I think to some extent, part of the credit is due our students. Our students like Elizabeth and Rita, who were very much committed, and many of them came to law school because of that commitment to doing the right thing for women's rights and gender rights more broadly, and the rights of racial and ethnic minorities. And I think to some extent, Ruth got caught up in that effort, partly because she was surrounded by so many students who were so passionately engaged in it. Obviously, she came to take an essential leadership role. But interestingly, I think others have commented that Ruth really had a fundamental change when she was in her 80s. She wasn't the notorious RBG before then. She was rather quiet and understated, brilliant, and a leader in terms of the evolution of law. But I think it was in her last years that she really, in a surprising way, flowered. Just one further thought about the law school. The law school came to be called the People's Electric Law School in the late 60s and early 70s because we really developed a tremendous passion for social justice. And I'm so proud of the law school and my colleagues on the faculty because they've kept that fire going. Indeed, they've probably enlarged and heated it up beyond even what was happening in the 60s and early 70s when Ruth was a faculty member. So there's a proud tradition of the law school, and we could not be any prouder of Ruth Bader Ginsburg than we are. Just a final personal note, what has clearly become my most treasured personal bit of memorabilia is a letter that Ruth Ginsburg sent to me on U.S. Supreme Court stationery in connection with an event the law school did around my retirement. And it's framed, it's in a place of honor. I look at it all the time, and especially in these last couple of days. So I'm delighted to be part of this celebration of Ruth's life and of her connection to the Rutgers Law School.
And we're happy to have you with us. And, you mentioned that she became a cultural icon, the notorious RBG. And there were also two movies made about her, one a documentary, RBG, and then there was the biopic on the basis of sex with Felicity Jones. And there's a great scene in that movie, and it's really a juxtaposition of her time at Harvard and the students were buttoned down. And then it shows Professor Ginsburg at Rutgers, which, needless to say, was much more earthy. And the scene really focuses on her decision to teach a class on women in the law. And that's why I'm really happy to have you with us, Elizabeth, because you were there on the front lines when all of this happened. So do you want to talk about your relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Women's Rights Law Report?
I came in at the tail end of Ruth's tenure. I entered in 1970, but she entered in 63. And I was just thinking about the fact that 63 was the year that Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. So we have this wonderful confluence of Ruth entering Rutgers and The Feminine Mystique being published. And in that book, Betty Friedan who was a housewife, described what she called a problem with no name. And that was what women were subjected to in that time. We know that Ruth had a really hard time getting a job in law. She couldn't get a job in law when she graduated first or so in her class. And many of us women at that time, let's think back, and we had great trouble taking seriously credibility and job-wise. And I know that Ruth had a great deal of trouble when I graduated Barnard with honors and could only get a secretarial job after that. In high school, interviewed for a combined medical school and undergraduate program, and I was told that my credentials were wonderful, but that because I was a woman, I would only take the place of a man in medicine. So those were the kinds of things we were up against, the women who entered in 1970. Our class entering in 70 was 20% women, which was outrageously high. And I was told at that time Rutgers was the place to go. So that got me to Rutgers. And when I arrived at Rutgers, I found that there were some very enthusiastic women students, but the mostly male, nearly all male faculty wasn't quite receptive or enthusiastic about women. And there were a lot of experiences in the class where I personally could say I was kind of put down for being a woman. It was a tough time. It was an exciting time, but it was a tough time. I just don't think the men, many of the men, not all of the men, of course, were ready for this onslaught of female law students. So we had these groups we organized. They were called consciousness-raising groups, and it was happening, it's a phenomenon happening around the United States. And I'd heard that there was one forming in New York, people with a lot of women law students. So I joined that consciousness-raising group, hoping to get some support. That fateful night at that meeting that I heard Anne Marie Boylan's story about having published one issue of a journal called the Women's Rights Law Reporter out of her small Newark apartment and being unable to raise any funds or find staff to continue publication. When I heard that, it struck me as perfectly obvious and simple that this law reporter should be brought to Rutgers. And I spoke to some other women, first-year students. They agreed. We got together and we decided we would make an effort to get the Women's Rights Law Reporter to Rutgers, where it would be safe and secure and well-funded. I organized a meeting, or I made an appointment with the dean at the time, and he was very skeptical about taking on this journal. There were many faculty members who felt that women's rights was just a fad, and our journal had more money. So he told me at that time, that if we could find a place, a room at the law school, someone gave us a place, and if we could find funding for our law journal, and if we could find a faculty advisor, we would permit the Women's Rights Law Reporter to be at Rutgers. I first went to Anna Mae Shepherd, another of the wonderful mentors and teachers at Rutgers Law School, and also a close friend. And Anna Mae was very supportive. She gave us a really nice, large room in the Urban Legal Clinic building, townhouse behind the main building, and we had a place. We organized some of the women in our group to write letters, fundraising letters. We were able to get some funds from the Wallace Eljabar Foundation, the Women's Center at Barnard College, and the Student Bar Association at Rutgers gave some money. So the last thing I had to do was find a faculty advisor. I didn't know Ruth Ginsburg at the time. I had heard that she was teaching conflicts of law and civil procedure. So I hadn't been a student of hers, but people said she was interested in women's rights law. And I had to go see her. I didn't expect anything from it, but she immediately said yes. And I was very, very surprised and delighted, we all were, to have a faculty member, a woman faculty member behind us. And she gave us a great deal of credibility among the faculty, among the students, and she helped with the editing. She wrote the lead article on Reed v. Reed, which was a case she was arguing before the Supreme Court. It was a pleasure to work with her, although she was tough, very, very tough. She was meticulous. Everything had to be done right. She was, in many ways, a taskmaster, but we appreciated that. So that was my time with Ruth at the law school. And there was more. She was a character, a person in my life from time to time as the years went by. In 1991, I had a jury trial in the District of Columbia. I was representing a young woman in a rape case, and it was a civil premises liability lawsuit against the landlord of the building. We received a directed verdict against us. I decided after much thinking to appeal that case. although it was a devastating loss, but a difficult case to begin with. I appealed that case, and when I filed the appellate brief, and when I walked into the Court of Appeals, she was on the panel, the three-judge panel for that case, and I was so thrilled that she was there. She ended up writing the opinion in Doe versus Dominion Bank, which turned out to be a landmark opinion in the District of Columbia. It was the first time that a landlord of an office building had been told they could be held liable for lack of security for the commercial tenants. And she wrote a fairly long opinion. In any event, she was an important person in our life, and she was critical to the continuation of the women's rights law, which has just celebrated its 50th anniversary.
Yeah, and it was such a wonderful celebration, and you came and you knocked it out of the park, and we had famed civil rights lawyer Deborah Katz there, so it was an outstanding celebration. I want to pull Rita into the conversation also. Rita, you were a student, you taught.
When I started at Rutgers at the law school
What year?
in 1965,
Okay.
there were two women on the faculty, Ruth Ginsburg and Eva Morales. They were both brilliant women. They couldn't have been more different personality if they had been hired for the differences. Ruth was, as you all know, very firm and determined, but always very kind. I graduated from the law school in 68. I had gone to law school because Arthur Knoy, who was also teaching at Rutgers on a part-time basis, was a civil rights lawyer, and I had met him in that capacity, and he was the one who convinced me that I should go to law school. And the years at Rutgers were fine years. I taught there in the clinical program from 72 to 75, and in the urban legal clinic with Anna Mae Shepherd. So I had the experience of being a student there and then of being on the faculty.
One of the things that I did a panel for the New York City Bar Association, and I was on the panel with the biographer Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote the notorious RBG. And she had mentioned, and this is something that I candidly mentioned to our students, that when Professor Ginsburg was there, that she was pregnant and she hid a pregnancy because she was concerned about discrimination, and that there was also some issues with pay. And I don't know if you guys heard anything about that while you were there, and if you wanted to comment on that.
No, I think we heard about it afterwards. But there certainly was this attitude, and Liz, I don't know what your experience was, but there certainly was this attitude at the time that you could be one or the other. You could be a parent or you could be a lawyer. But heaven forbid you couldn't do both.
That's right. And that was actually codified in some of the laws. I remember going to the unemployment office to collect unemployment at one point when I was pregnant. And as soon as I started to show, the law said in the District of Columbia that women could not collect unemployment once they were 3 months pregnant.
Wow.
Because a prerequisite to obtaining the unemployment was certifying that we'd made application to a certain number of jobs every week or every month. And they said nobody would want to hire you or even interview you if you were pregnant. And also I was fired from a job, a public interest job, after I had morning sickness.
It's exactly those types of barriers that really inspired Ruth Bader Ginsburg to become a legal titan with the ACLU, and really, I think, one of the leading civil rights lawyers in our nation's history. What do you guys recall about her leaving the school? I know that we're very proud of the time that she spent there, and in her public comments about Rutgers, she talks about how Rutgers always remains steadfast in its commitment to diversity. But what do you recall about us losing her to Columbia?
David, let me just jump on that and a couple of other things that are related. I think as proud as we were about Rutgers' distinctive character as the People's Electric Law School, as proud as we were of its incredible public interest work, I think there was also the feeling that we had not yet achieved quite the status of the Ivy League law schools. So, in a sense, it was not surprising that when opportunities arose for some of our faculty, it was not just Ruth, it was others as well. I don't think it raised, it was a unique experience. I don't remember it as having an enormous effect, although there was a sense of real loss given the role that Ruth had begun to stake out. I do want to add a couple of things, if I can, about the conversation about how difficult it was to be a woman at law school, if not at Rutgers, and in the profession, because I think to some extent at Rutgers that changed by as soon as the middle 70s. The number of women law students burgeoned, and a lot of women came back to law school after they'd raised children until they were at an age where they were full-time in school. And we had a large group of women, many of whom have gone on to be prominent in the bar and the bench, who were widely known at the law school, at least, as the band of mothers. So I think there was a bit of a flip in a good direction, at least within the law school, if not all that broadly in the profession. I just wanted to do two updating things that relate to Ruth, because I think although she left Rutgers for Columbia, to a considerable extent, her heart remained at Rutgers, and that led to her having continuing, at least periodic connections with Rutgers. I know when I was involved in putting together some law school centennial programs in 2008, she was enormously supportive. She actually recorded a couple of videos at the court, which were specifically for us to use as part of our programs. And sometime around then, I don't remember the precise year, there was an extraordinary, maybe unprecedented, I'm not sure about that event involving Rutgers. We had a law graduate, I think in 1969, named Bill Hodes, who was number one in his class at Rutgers. And Bill went on to become a law professor at Indiana Law School. He got the idea, after he was quite a senior law professor, that he wanted to clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was after Ruth had joined the court as a justice. So the bottom line of a fairly long story is Bill wound up as a fairly senior law professor, becoming a law clerk for Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court. To me, it bespoke Ruth's continuing strong feelings for Rutgers.
Let me ask you one thing. I know that, Elizabeth, you were part of the town hall tribute with our students the other day, and Frank and Marilyn Askin joined us. Frank Askin was a former director of the Constitutional Law Clinic. Marilyn Askin is a former student and also taught at Rutgers. And so they were remembering Ruth Bader Ginsburg and really told the story about how, in many ways, she found a voice there with a focus on the gender equity issues that really inspired her to move over to the ACLU and do the tremendous work. But that, because of students like Rita and Elizabeth, that, she really started to, and she said this herself, that she went to the library and realized that just about every legal history was written through the eyes of men. And that's what really catalyzed her to put together the Women in the Law course. Do you have any memory of that, any of you, in terms of her kind of going through that evolution there, just in terms of her early embrace of issues of gender equity?
Well, there were three things that were going on that I think were influential at that time that come to mind. One is that Rutgers was willing to take enormous risks, and I think they probably took a risk in hiring her in '63. Thinking back to to 63, she was having trouble getting a job, a legal job. But it was also a time of social unrest and ferment that was affecting the whole country. We had a Vietnam War. We had all kinds of racial unrest. There were all kinds of social movements. So that must have affected her. And the last thing was her own experiences, the discrimination that she faced, all those together. I think it's not surprising that she got interested in women's legal rights and sort of everything gelled and she began working in that area.
Well, let me ask you all about her legacy. If you could pick one or two of your favorite opinions that Justice Ginsburg wrote, what would they be? What jumps to mind for you as perhaps being some of her most influential decisions?
Well, if you take away the decisions, I think one important legacy, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is that she became RBG and she welcomed it. And that led her to connect with the younger generation so that they came to know her and love her. And that doesn't happen very often. So we have a beautiful connection that she left between her legal work, her thoughts, her work on the Supreme Court, and a generation now. They were filling the steps of the court and paying tribute to her.
Along the same line, I think she became larger than any individual decisions she wrote, whether in the majority or the dissent, and she became this absolutely iconic figure. I mean, we know of contributions she made piece by piece to the law, but I think she assumed, particularly in her last years, kind of overarching quality and character that really surpassed and overpowered any individual decisions.
I think it's a very important point because she behaved always with dignity, but she didn't come across in any way as full of herself or holier than thou. And I think an awful lot of people who don't know a great deal about legal practice came to respect her and admire her because she felt so real.
That's beautifully said. Any other final memories of Ruth Bader Ginsburg or People's Electric Law School back in the day, or newer back during that era?
Well, let me jump in with something that to me has always represented this incredible, and being a senior citizen, I think I can use the word senior citizen transformation and elevation of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I had periodic contacts with Ruth over the years and with Marty Ginsburg, her husband. One of them was at a Danforth Foundation event at one of the ski resorts in Colorado, happened to be during the summer. But Danforth ran these programs for fairly senior federal judges. Ruth at the time was on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and she and Marty came to this program that was focusing on education law, and I was one of the faculty. And because of the Rutgers connection, we tended to gravitate toward one another. We would eat most of our meals together. And one morning, Marty came down looking so delighted and happy. And the others of us at the table said, "Marty, what's going on? It looks like something great in your life." He said, "It's a wonderful day." I said, "Really? What happened?" He said, "Ruth smiled this morning." And she had this, in some ways, this dour demeanor, where not only was she quiet and understated, but you would think she didn't have much of a sense of humor. And that, if that was ever true, it certainly, that perception changed in the last 6 or 8 or 10 years of her life where she became a public figure. She had a twinkle in her eye. People fell in love with her in a way I don't think she permitted them to do earlier on. Obviously, Marty was in love with her, but even he would kind of poke fun at her apparent lack of sense of humor, which may never have been the case, but certainly was the perception. And I don't know of any other person, be they prominent or not, who seemed to go through such a metamorphosis in their life, from somebody who was quiet and understated to somebody who became this cultural icon. And so I remember, and with great fondness, that about her as well.
That's a lovely thought. Any other thoughts, Rita? Just as a practicing lawyer, as a Rutgers Law graduate, as a former faculty member, what are your final thoughts of those days in Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Well, the law school was quite unique. It really was. We've, over the years, gotten to know an awful lot of lawyers who trained at different schools around the country, and it has magnified for us the uniqueness, the specialness about the law school at Rutgers. As far as Justice Ginsburg is concerned, she was a remarkable woman. We are fortunate, those of us who had the opportunity to know her.
My final thoughts are that by the time she had spent some years on the Supreme Court, that she had really made her mark. That enabled her to smile more and to be more open and joyous. And I keep thinking about the image of her doing push-ups. She was one of us, and letting her exercise teacher publish a book about her exercise program, and her love of the opera. And I would run into her at opera performances. She just was a person who loved life and became more comfortable in her own shoes as she grew on the Supreme Court and was able to become the RBG that we know today.
We have, like I said, we're collecting memories, and we have that, on the website. So, I think this is going to be a great opportunity for a lot of you who were there during that period of time to, share memories and certainly reconnect. And I know for me, and, Paul knows this, just to hear the stories about the history of this school are just incredibly inspiring. And I will say for our students, it's been inspiring as well. They're very proud of the foundation and the legacy of the school, and all three of you are a big part of that. So thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Our honor to do it.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you all of you.
The Power of Attorney is produced by Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations minutes from Philadelphia and New York City, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more about Rutgers Law by visiting law.rutgers.edu.